Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Cheryl Van Daalen-Smith, the Associate Dean Academic in the Faculty of Grad Studies. I'm so thrilled that you've come. Today, we're going to talk about the oral exam, or what gets called the defense. And what I'm going to try and do, together with two panelists, is to demystify what this is about and make sure that you know how to get ready and how to be prepared. If you have questions along the way, put them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And once the panelists are done, I'll be looking in there and I'll be pulling forward some questions for our panelists. Ready to go? Here we go. To begin, I want to just recognize the lands that we are on here at York University, and I invite you, wherever you are, since we're virtual, to also be cognizant of the lands and your relationship to the lands. It's very important to us here at York, and I'm sure it's important to you as well. So the goal of today's scholarly skills session, we like to call it scholarly skills, is to demystify this important milestone. There's a lot of questions about what this is, and sometimes students get to it without really knowing what it's about. I'm going to explain the goal and the general structure of final defense and its oral exam and get you sort of in the know of what to expect and give you tips on preparation for success. But you won't have to get the tips from me. I've got two panelists who successfully defended who are going to speak to you. There will be time for questions for sure. So let's start by demystifying things. Since starting your grad studies, you've probably heard about the defense and the oral exam and wondered what exactly are those? So this is what's called a milestone. And you have a grad studies journey, and often starts with courses. Well, it starts with getting in, and then it starts with courses. This is typically the final milestone. So let's get clear on some terms. The examination, so when you think about what's my exam, it's about the thesis or dissertation that you hand in, and it's also the oral exam. So the oral exam means an opportunity where you're actually speaking about your work and you're orally responding to oral questions. And you're meant to demonstrate how much you understand. And by the time you get there, you actually know your work best. So this is my first time I'm going to say to you, try not to worry, because by the time you get there, you really know your work well. So what does the defense mean? Does it mean you have to be defensive and you're on the spot? Well, no, you don't have to be defensive. And yes, you're a little bit on the spot, but hopefully in a nice scholarly discussion styled way. You'll be asked questions about your topic or the method or the analysis or your findings, and you need to be able to answer questions about that. What I'd like you to do, though, is to think of it as an opportunity to show what you know. So what exactly is the oral exam or the defense? As I said, it's the final milestone of doctoral degrees, and some master's degrees close with an oral exam and a defense. In some programs, there's an oral exam that's part of your comprehensives, but for today, I'm going to be focusing on the oral exam as the final milestone for you. It's an opportunity for you to demonstrate your grasp of the work and to come to voice about it. It's a time when you're going to have a circle around you. You're encircled by other scholars who are interested in your work for a scholarly conversation. It's where your knowledge and understanding is assessed, but that's okay because you'll have prepared. And you get an opportunity to present your work in a way that makes sense to you and then answer questions. Well, who gets to come to your defense? So you'll have an examining committee made up of an internal examiner that's external to your program, and you'll have an external examiner, and this is somebody external to your university. Both are meant to be at arm's length with no conflict of interest with you or your supervisory committee. The exam also has a chair that serves as a dean's representative, and often this is your grad program director or their designate. And their role is to make sure that it's a smooth exam and it's fair. Your supervisor and your committee members are present and they participate. In many programs, it's a public defense, meaning that other students and faculty can attend. And this should be nice for you to know that you can invite a friend or a family member or a loved one or a peer from your cohort. A lot of my students bring somebody, they have 2 or 3. One of my most recent ones brought their grandmother, and it was wonderful. So when will you know that it's time for you to go forward? Okay, just moving something on my screen. Hang on, there. So when is it going to happen? So once your work has been reviewed and revised, and that's where you go, oh, do I have to revise it again? Well, yes, because it gets to the strongest it can be so that then you're ready to proceed to defense. And this is often done by consensus. Your whole committee says, is Cheryl ready? Do we think she's good to go? Yes, 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 yes. And then you're ready to go. Okay. So how do we build our examining committee? So along the way, conversations would have occurred, I hope, or should occur if it's in your future, about potential inside York and potential outside York scholars who align in some way with your work. And normally a list is developed by consensus, and you're part of that consensus building. Once you're getting close, the supervisor would connect, not you, but the supervisor connects with potential examiners. But they typically should be speaking with the grad program director, just making sure this person is suitable. And you must be and remain at arm's length from any examiners. Once everything's confirmed, your examining committee is sent a copy of your thesis or dissertation or your creative work by your supervisor or by the program, not by you. That way you stay arm's length. All right, so what happens at my oral exam? So look how fast I've moved you all the way to the end, and now you're ready and the stuff's gone out and now it's the day. But 5 days before your scheduled exam, the chair of your examining committee will poll everybody to ask, is this thesis or dissertation examinable? And in my experience as an associate dean, it's generally yes. Most of the time, it's a yes. On the day, the examining committee, you and any guests, will be welcomed into the space for introductions. And if I may, I'm hoping that you think about having an in-person exam. It's really a very special memory that you'll be creating when it's in person. People are with you in the room. So let's pretend it's a room. So you'll be welcomed into the space and there's introductions. Then a super awkward thing happens and the chair says, okay, thank you very much. I'm going to get you, the candidate, and any of your guests to step out. You're thinking, but I just got in here. Well, what happens is the committee then deliberates over what's our process, who's going to ask questions first, and, does anybody need to leave early, and these sorts of things. So we do that away from you. Why make you nervous? Then you'll be welcomed back in, and then you're asked to give your presentation. It's typically a PowerPoint, but I'll speak to that in a moment. Once you're done, you'll be thanked, and you'll be relieved, and then the question rounds begin. Typically, questions move from the person furthest from you. I don't mean physically furthest, but the least is the furthest away sort of from the work you've been doing for the last few years. That's generally the external examiner. So typically goes the external examiner gets to ask you a bunch of questions, and they ask you a lot the first round. So then the internal external person, that's the person who's from York but not in your program. And then maybe one of your committee members, another committee member, and then your supervisor last, because they're the closest to you. That's round one. And if you're my student, I'm giving you eye movements to say, have a drink of water. So first round is often longer, and the questions are often broad and thick. And the external examiner takes the most time with you. I would suggest to you, if you're writing notes, write this down, is when you're being asked questions, have a pen and a piece of paper and write them down as they're asking you questions. Because you know how academics are, they sometimes ask you 3 questions in one. So write them down. If you're unsure, you could say, now I just want to be clear, when you were asking about X, did you mean, and then you're clear on what you're answering. And then you look at what's in front of you and you can say, okay, I think I'm going to answer your second question first. So you take charge, answer in a way that makes sense to you. So The second round often involves more specific questions. They might say on page 132, I notice you speak about Foucault or some study. And so I really want you to bring your thesis or dissertation with you that day. You might want to have it dog-eared, if you will, or have little sort of stick-on dividers so you can find things. You're not asked to know things by memory, but I bet you're going to know what they're talking about. So they might ask you a specific question. So around the pipe, everybody goes again, external, internal, committee members, supervisor, the chair might ask a question or two. Then we ask, is a third round of questions necessary? Sometimes it is, sometimes only a couple of the people say I have a question. So once that's done, you'll be thanked, and then you'll be invited to step out while the examining committee deliberates. Don't worry as you watch the time click away. It often takes about a half an hour because we're in there discussing and then we're signing papers and such. Then you and your guests will be welcomed back in the room and the results are shared with you. And sometimes it involves some revisions. That's okay. That's normal. So how can you be successful? That's really why I wanted you to come today and why Faculty of Grad Studies wanted to do this scholarly skills session with you and for you. You know, you've taken months to write and revise if it's your proposal for your comp exam or your thesis or dissertation for your final exam. You know the work best, as does your supervisor, and they should know the work best. But the first thing you want to do after it gets sent off to the examining committee is for you to reread it. And you're thinking, oh, I've been with it for months. Yes, but this way it's super fresh. And that way you know the story of your work from front to back. Re-immerse yourself in the literature. Re-immerse yourself in your purpose or the methods or the lenses, we might call those theoretical lenses, the findings or your discussions or the implications. Being freshly prepared for the exam is key to being ready for whatever you'll be asked. And I would ask you to prepare these 3 things as you're getting ready for your exam. So it's got sent off. So how do I get prepared for this? First, you want to have a presentation prepared. Second, you want to have a corresponding script that you write and you read. And third, a list of responses to anticipated questions, which I'm going to speak to you about. Sometimes I find a handout is also much appreciated. A couple of my students have done that. One recently did their whole mind map of all their findings and analysis, all the themes and sub-themes. Another one has a sort of like a pictogram of Instagram posts of the girls that she interviewed. It's very cool. And I find the examining committee likes to see something in their hands that you can speak to. So you might want to think about that, all of you. So we talked about preparing an oral presentation, right? So normally it's a PowerPoint or another way you want to display your work. I find a PowerPoint's helpful and a script. So you have notes. So you don't go rogue, right? So it usually involves an introduction, what are the goals and the research questions, a little précis, small summary of the literature, a little bit about methodology, and this should be brief typically. It does vary by discipline. I will say that, I want to underline that I'm giving you general guidance, but within your own discipline, you want to be asking for any specifics. Maybe it rolls differently in biology as it does in social anthropology or music or nursing. So ask. So maybe you want to include key findings, some discussion points, some recommendations, for sure that you're able to identify a limitation or two of your work, that you're self-aware of that. That's cool. And then maybe next steps. This does vary by discipline also, but as a general guideline, 25 to 30 minutes to present is a general guideline. So I would tell you to prepare in chunks, meaning as you're preparing that PowerPoint and you're writing a script that goes with it, and you're writing the script about what you want to say about the literature, just work on that for half of a day as you're preparing for your exam. Now, don't try and not do the whole thing at once. It's really overwhelming. And then you end up putting everything in there and your presentation's an hour and you have 50 slides, and then your supervisor says, uh-oh, we need to cut this back. So let's talk a little bit about the next step. So you've prepared a PowerPoint slide, you prepared a script. Now I'd super want you to be prepared to answer questions. Well, how do you know? So what I want to tell you is normally you can anticipate questions about why the title? Tell me about the topic. How do you hope to contribute to the field? Why did you choose this theoretical approach or paradigm versus that theoretical approach or paradigm? Maybe something that's in the literature you might be asked about. You might be asked about your research questions. So, no, basically, you might be asked about everything. And again, I say to you, that's okay, because you've been reading it and writing about it and revising it and talking with your committee about it. You really know it best. So I'm going to give you some ideas about the kinds of questions to anticipate at an exam. And for myself, I find it helpful. I have my students get an answer to all of these. And then we go to the exam and they might get asked 2 of them. But anyway, they were ready. And that's the most important thing. When you go in there feeling ready and you really can't get asked a question that's going to throw you, then you feel more confident. Most of the oral defense will have questions that fall into 6 categories. 1, you might be asked to clarify something. You might read something and want you to say more about something. They might want you to justify something. You know, can you tell me why you are suggesting this recommendation? Can you say a bit more? And that's kind of where the language of defense comes from. And so you're able to provide a justification. I'm recommending this policy for harm reduction because, for example, it's one of my students. Have you thought about this alternative is sometimes a question. You may or may not have, and I'm going to talk to you in a moment about what to do when we get asked a question and we just don't know. You might get a question around your awareness of other work. You may or may not be aware of other work. You will be aware of a lot of work, but you can't know everything. They might ask you to create a distinction between work that's sort of similar, and that goes to what's the special new thing your work is adding. Oh, they might say there's an error in your work. That's okay, don't freak out. As long as somebody read your work closely, that's fantastic. So, common questions. What is your topic? Why did you choose it? You might get asked in one sentence, what exactly is your thesis, which is your key argument, right, everyone? We know that. How does your topic contribute to the existing literature, or how did you decide on the sources to include? You know that. You know why you chose different literature. How is your topic important? Right? So now not the why, but how is your topic important? Not why is important, but in what ways is your topic important? That's why I want you to prepare an answer, because we could all go on and on about that one for sure. What topics overlap with your area? You might get asked, what are the key findings of your work? Or, you know, what type of background research or inquiry did you do for your study? So what did you sort of immerse yourself in for a while before you landed on this study? Why did you choose your particular methodology? Say you were doing human participant research, you might be asked, you know, who formed the sample group of your study? Why did you choose that particular population? What were your key findings? Of course, in relation to the research question. What did you learn from your study? What are your key takeaways? I mean, that you'll know cold. You won't even need a note about that. You know, did you relate your study to existing thoughts or theories in the literature? Were there any findings? I love this question. Was there anything that surprised you? I like to always ask that one. What's original about your work? What do your results mean? So there's some overlap in these. What are the recommendations from your study? You'll have presented that though. How has your research contributed to current thinking or knowledge in the field? How can your findings be put into practice? If given the chance, would you do anything differently and why? That one's kind of cool. Recommendations for policy practice research, or the very, very popular what's next question. That's usually the last question. It's usually your supervisor. What do you plan to do professionally after the study? So, as I said, I was going to say my students, I see you all as my students. Maybe you can be my students for 1 hour. Is that preparation best practices mean practice, practice, practice. So you have a presentation planned, you have a script. Do I ever want you to practice running it through? We call that a mock exam. Do it with your supervisor, do it with a friend, do it with peers. And the more you practice, the quality of your talk goes up, the better it gets. And I want you to follow your instincts. So let's say you feel really nervous, like, oh my gosh, I hope no one asked me about this. Then that's where I really want you to get ready. If you're nervous about a section, pay attention to those nerves and be proactive and say, I want to get stronger in that. I want to be ready for a question about that. Another one. So you've prepared, you've practiced, and you're ready. You're in the exam. Do I ever want you to not go rogue and don't go off script? So where possible. So stick to your script. And then when you're answering questions, really try to prevent going off on tangents, because sometimes we might be read that we don't have a grasp of our work if we seem to be rambling or we've gone off in some big tangent. So really being prepared, staying on script, staying with your planned responses to some of the questions. Because really in this, you're meant to demonstrate your grasp of your work and your ability, what we call capacity, to respond to questions about the work. So let's say you get asked a question that you don't know. It happens. Happened in my own oral exam, both of them. Whatever you do, don't try to flub it. Like, don't try to fake it. Don't try to flub it. Sometimes folks ask a question that just don't pertain to the study. Or that we made a decision, you and me, if I was your supervisor, we said, we just can't work on that. It's too big. We'll put it over here for when we're done. And so sometimes you get asked a question that we just don't know. And if that's the case, you can indicate that your work didn't specifically address this area or this question, but then you can refer to a study that came close if you know. Like maybe in your thinking, you're thinking in the moment, and they're asking about something that you didn't focus on, but you remember reading something about it, in maybe something close about it, you can mention that. And this goes back to me asking you to reread your work front to back, fresh prior to the defense. Finally, you could also say, you know what, just like Homer, it's a very good question. I hadn't considered it. And that is an honest response. I'd like to take that forward with me for future consideration. Okay, I hope that you remember that. A few do's and don'ts, and I'm almost going to hand you over to why you really came, and that's to hear two alumni speak, is some do's and don'ts. Do rehearse your materials often. Do rehearse before the day. Do have a script for each of your slides. Try to limit your ideas on these slides as well. Have a story that you will tell. Do prepare for questions and attend to your wellness, both physical and emotional, leading up to it. Please have breakfast. I can't tell you how many students come, they didn't feel like eating, and then they get in there and they're they feel a bit wobbly. Some don'ts. Please don't put off working on your presentation or your anticipated question responses until the last minute because you're nervous. Excuse me, it'll just make you more nervous. Try not overdoing the number of slides or the amount we put on our slides if you can. Don't fudge or give answers out of context. Don't provide vague descriptions or explanations. I know you won't prepare poorly. You've come to this webinar, you're motivated. And where you can, not allowing stress to overwhelm you. And you might say, well, how am I going to do that, Cheryl? And I'm saying you prepare, and the things that make you nervous, you prepare even more so on those sections. A couple more things to consider. Please put colored marker flags on the side of your thesis or dissertation, marking out each chapter or important parts. So be there in front of you, they'll ask a question, you can whip and take a look and say, actually, so-and-so said such and such, and you can answer. All my students find it helpful to have that in front of them. Another thing to consider is to defend without being defensive. You just need to justify your approach. Also, what will happen is that your work will either be accepted with no or some revisions, generally. So make sure that you have time to do that afterwards while things are fresh. There's something called defending and defining. So if you get a question that says, why didn't you do X or Y? Acknowledge what you could have done, and then explain what you opted to do instead. Okay? Ask friends to give you a mock exam, and also your supervisor you should do a mock exam with, or peers and friends. And finally, I think finally, you will be challenged. It will be challenging, and that's okay. It's grad studies. It's meant to be tough. That's why you're a grad student. So I'm going to now invite our panelists to join me. I'm going to take this slide down in one moment. We have two recent grads who successfully defended their work. We have Sian Marks and Sehrish Malik. And I will stop sharing. What I'm going to do, what's going to happen here, this is for our audience, is Sian first is going to present, and I've asked both of our panelists to talk about their experience of their oral exam, how they prepared, and to give you some tips. So we'll first start with Sian, and then we'll move to Sehrish, and then I'll be looking in the Q&A box, and then we'll have time for questions. So I actually saved you both way more time, so this is good. So welcome, Sian. I'll start with you. Go ahead, introduce yourself, and please take over.
Okay, hi everyone. My name's Sian Marks. So just a little bit of context. I recently graduated the psychology master's program here at York University in the brain behavior and cognitive sciences stream. And I also completed a graduate diploma in neuroscience. So essentially, in short, my research looked at examining the sex differences in visual motor skills, cognition, and emotionality following concussion in our York University athletes. So essentially, my overall experience of my oral exam was very good. It was a much different experience than I initially anticipated, but in a very positive way. So like Cheryl stated earlier, my thesis defense, it started with the introduction where we were asked to leave the room. I had a presentation. Mine for our department or psychology was limited to 15 minutes. Then we had a question and answer session. And for my defense, that took the majority of the time. And then there was a deliberation. I left the room for about half an hour or so. And then they brought me back into the room to let me know my results. So for me, I passed with minor revisions. So there were a few changes that I had to make to some plots and to add a table in my results section. And then I did that within a period, I believe, of 2 weeks after I defended. And then once that was accepted, everything was good to go. The entire defense itself was about 2 hours, but the time does pass very quickly because you're so engrossed in the process and answering the questions, you really don't notice the time passing very slowly, which I think is a good thing, especially when you have a little bit of nerves. So my presentation went fairly smoothly because I practiced a lot. And the part that I was most apprehensive about was the question and answer session. Because I wasn't really familiar or given a lot of information about the defense process itself. I was expecting it to be much more intimidating and scarier than it was. I thought it was just going to be a rapid fire of questions and, possibly things to trick you or things like that. But it really wasn't. So hopefully that can provide a little bit of reassurance to you guys. It was much more conversational, just really asking clarification questions, things like Cheryl mentioned in her presentation, things about, for me specifically, my questions were centered around my method. So clarifying some things in my method. So why did you decide to use this type of assessment to measure visual motor performance versus this, kind of clarifying things like that. There was an epidemiologist in my panel, so I had a lot of questions surrounding stats. So that's one thing I made sure I prepared well for, is preparing and understanding why I used a certain statistical analysis versus another. And because of the type of research I did, concussion research, I had a lot of clinical based questions as well. So those might depend or differ based on the faculty or type of research you're doing. But for me, that's how mine went. In terms of preparing for my oral exam, so I made sure that I knew my research well, front to back. And by the time you're presenting, you're really going to be an expert in your research. So that's something that I think comes naturally with the process. But again, like Cheryl said, making sure you review your thesis multiple times from intro to conclusion. And that's something I really had to make sure I did, and knowing what types of literature I referenced in my introduction, because I know that was something that I was possibly going to be asked. And also making sure that I was updated with any type of latest developments in my field, or any type of novel findings that I might have been asked in comparison to my research. I also made sure that I asked around about my committee members, from my supervisor, lab members, other people who had those professors in their committee, to know what types of questions did they ask you. Do you know any types of questions that you think that they might ask me based on what my research is? That was really important in helping me prepare kind of like a list of questions to go over and expect. Practicing my presentation multiple times. So I did that with my lab members and my supervisors. So we had a few mock sessions. And then I also did that with my family and friends. And I think the one with my family and friends was pretty important because it provides a different lens, especially for people who aren't generally familiar with your research. A lot of times they can ask very simplified questions, which I think is very good, because sometimes those simple questions you would think are the easiest to know, but especially under pressure, those are things that can possibly trip you up. So just kind of broadens the scope in terms of, the types of questions that you can prepare for. And another thing I did that I think really helped was to simulate the environment. So again, doing mock presentations to simulate the experience. If you're doing it in person, can you possibly do a mock presentation in the room, get familiar with the setup, things like that, that can kind of help alleviate some nerves sometimes. And for me, the final thing I did was I prepared kind of like a binder with my thesis, with different tabs of sections that might be relevant to reference. I didn't use that as much, but the next thing I did that did really help me was I prepared some additional PowerPoint presentation slides that were hidden at the end of my presentation. So things like extra tables, extra stats that might not have been there, but might have been relevant to bring up or reference during the question and answer session. And then finally, just to kind of wrap it up quickly, some of my advice would be, again, to prepare well. Again, at this point, you're going to be an expert. This is your research. This is your work. You've been doing, for a lengthy amount of time. But it's still, given that, it's still important to review your work as much as you can, but within reason. I didn't want to kind of cram too much, or, give myself heighten my anxiety by, you know, um, kind of like reviewing my work too much, I would say. So kind of finding that balance of preparing enough, but not overwhelming yourself, I think is important too, because there also is that aspect of, kind of, mediating your mental health, and kind of making sure that you're not making yourself too nervous before the process. Anticipating questions again, so asking around, and kind of like the resources that were presented here, kind of making sure you have that prepared. Don't rush your responses. And my supervisor, one big thing she said was not to cram. That again can heighten your anxiety. And one big thing for me, especially because I have a tendency to and a lot of us at this stage have a tendency to, strive for perfection, which is a good thing, but I would say don't necessarily expect perfection. There's going to be questions that you won't know. There's going to be things that you might not know how to answer, but you've prepared as best as you can. Just answer them to the best of your abilities. And just because you're not able to answer a question like you think you might have been able to, doesn't speak towards your capacity or your lack thereof as a researcher. You know what you're doing. You're brought to this stage. Everyone's setting you up for success, not for failure. So that's kind of, my take on everything.
Wow, that's fantastic. Thank you, Cian. I'm seeing questions coming into the chat. I'm inviting more to go in there now, especially you can even say for Cian, for Sehrish, and then as I'm answering some live, but I want to save some that I can ask you to. So thank you. Take a breather now, Cian. And Sehrish, I'm going to turn to you, my friend. Welcome, and please go ahead.
Hi everyone, Cian, that was such a beautiful presentation. Something that really stood out for me is this idea of the perfection. And I have this line, perfection, well, it's not mine. I think I copied it from someone. Perfection is the enemy of good enough. And so there's a point that we get to towards the end that you just have to be content with. Hello everyone. First of all, I want to say a big thank you to Professor Van Daalen-Smith and Professor Victor Shi for inviting me to speak with you today. My name is Sehrish Malik, and I successfully defended my dissertation in Humanities on August 14, 2024. I also graduated with diploma in Asian Studies and Comparative Literature. My research explored Alice Jardine's biography of Yulia Kristeva's life and work, diving into psychoanalysis, motherhood, loss, and mourning. Before, though, I talk about my own personal experience, I really want to emphasize what Professor Van Daalen-Smith said during her excellent presentation. This reframing this idea that this is an opportunity to present your hard work and not just something you have to defend. So changing our language around how we perceive this big day. So another thing I want to say is I actually appreciate the title of this talk, this idea of the road to defense and demystifying and preparing for your oral exam, because it really truly captures the essence of my own experience. The reason being is it's this concept of a road. It's a journey that takes time, effort, energy, and it's something to navigate, something rather than something that can be completed in a single day. And so emphasizing this demystifying is crucial because the process often feels very overwhelming and, to be honest, even quite intimidating. And so I recognize that fear is a significant part of this experience, which Cian and Professor Van Daalen-Smith touched on. And I want us to intentionally hold space for that. I love this line from Gabor Mate. He says, I quote, we may not be responsible for the world we may not be responsible for the way the world creates our mind, but we can take responsibility for the mind with which we create our world. I love that quote because it's exactly how I approached my defense. Of course, I was scared. Who wouldn't be? Especially for me, since my external examiner was Dr. Alice Jardine herself. And my entire dissertation was subtly critiquing how she overlooked the maternal in Kristeva's life and work. And so I was really, really scared closer to the exam. But fear, as I learned throughout this process and research, doesn't have to paralyze you. It can be a motivator and a space to work through our creativity. Or paying attention to our work. And so the only way to work through these fears were to face them. And so I want to leave you with a few things here because this is precisely how I tackled it. Number one is anticipate questions. So anticipate questions. So I sat with my supervisor and my program director to brainstorm potential questions. I asked them to walk me through the process. I didn't have access to these kind of webinars at that time. Otherwise, I would have been first one around here. So you have this great opportunity to do that here. All of this helped me feel prepared for the tough questions that I could have potentially been asked. One thing that really stuck with me was something that Professor Van Daalen-Smith said. She talked about how feeling nervous about a specific area is actually a signal. So in other words, your nervousness is pointing out a gap in your understanding. So pay attention to those moments of nervousness and use them as a guide, because what I did was when I was preparing for my presentation for my defense, I turned that nervousness into an opportunity so that I could start feeling more confident and ready in those areas. Number two, ask for help. So I wasn't shy about reaching out to mentors and other students who had graduated before me to give me advice on what to do and what to avoid during my exam. And honestly, their feedback was gold. Number three, I observed others. So I attended other oral exams to understand the process better. Like when you're asked to step out, when you're asked to step back in, and it just made the whole process less mysterious for me. And number four, I actually researched my examiners. So I dug into my examiners' work to understand their work. And I want to share this funny moment from my oral exam is when Dr. Jardine asked me why I didn't interview her for my dissertation. I did my entire dissertation on her biography, but why didn't I come to interview her? Because I had done this research on her, I read about her before my exam, and I reminded her that she had once knocked on Simone de Beauvoir's door for an interview, and I said that I wasn't actually as quite as bold as her yet. And that research gave me the confidence to engage with her on a personal level. She chuckled at that because she did not see that coming. But the biggest thing is, you have to practice, practice, practice. As Cian was mentioning in her presentation, I rehearsed so many times, sometimes with my supervisor, with friends, sometimes just to myself, talking to the wall. I even roped in my husband, my small kids to listen to and give feedback. So Cian, I'm really with you on there when you talked about that in your talk. There's a line in neuroscience that I love: neurons that fire together, wire together. So the more I practiced, the stronger my confidence became. And on the final day, pretty much I found that all the questions that I'd practiced for, I was somehow able to weave them into my answers. So the point is, I guess, that fear isn't the enemy. It's natural to feel nervous, but you can channel that energy into your preparation. Remember the 3 R's here. You read, you research, you rehearse, and make it a part of your non-negotiable process as you're preparing for this. And remember, you don't have to do this alone. Lean on your mentors, your friends and family, and this journey is meant for you to be shared. And in the end, you'll look back at yourself and feel so proud of what you were able to do for yourself and to show up for yourself. Yes, you were scared, but you did it anyway, and that's what really counts. So thank you, and the best of luck to all of you for your own road to defense. You've got this.
Thank you both. Well, I could just sit back and listen. I actually wrote several things down that you identified. So stay with us, Sehrish and Cian. So I don't see a lot of questions directly for you all. What I want to do is say, do the panelists have any advice to calm nerves prior to and during the exam? Maybe I'll start with Sehrish.
Absolutely. So I'm a bit biased because I'm a mindfulness practitioner. So I teach folks meditation, and I do CBT. And so one of the things that really helped for me is this CBT idea of pattern interruption. And so I have this narrative where I fall back into fear or anxiety when I'm asked a question. And so I'll interrupt it with another thought like, oh no, I've prepared for this. Like, I know this. And I don't mean to demean this, but I'm like, I know this better than anybody else because I've researched this inside out. And so I'll rewrite that narrative, that fear, that nervousness every time that came up for me. And this idea that I wasn't good enough, that would constantly come up for me. And I practiced these mantras, these contemplations so much ahead of time that on the day of I could bring those tools back to rewrite that narrative. And every time I felt like I was stuck and I couldn't answer, I was like, no, I can do this. I've got this. And another thing is that this is actually from my supervisor. She taught me this. She said, sometimes when you feel like you don't have the answer, just kind of keep going, and the answer will find itself. Not in a way that you're deceiving anyone, but like that it gives you an answer to kind of. Psychoanalysis has this idea of working through. So allow yourself to work through, not to jumble mumble, but giving yourself the space and time to transition into the place that you need to. So anyways, those were part of my preparations to help with nervousness.
Wonderful. I sort of want you to do a mindfulness for all of us here. But Cian, do you have any ideas calming nerves either prior to or during the exam?
So for me, two things that really help. So prior to, I made sure that I kind of divided my time equally, in terms of preparing for the exam, and also making sure that I was doing tasks and activities that I already enjoy. So, trying to maintain those hobbies, things that will kind of get your mind off of the stress. That was what, worked for me. So for me, things like going on walks, continuing to go to the gym, those things. So whatever is already in your schedule or routine, I would say try to maintain those things. I know it can be stressful because you have a lot of things to prepare, but kind of make sure you divide your time, I think, equally, can kind of help alleviate some of that stress. And during the exam, what I've found, even during my master's, like during undergrad, I was never someone to sit at the front of the class, always relatively shy. And, even during my master's, working on my presentation skills was really a big learning curve. But for me, what helped get through it and what I actively used in my defense was breathing. It really sounds very simple, but kind of making sure you focus on your breathing and really try to, that for me kind of helped alleviate some of the anxiety. So, I don't know, that's just kind of my in exam
Yeah.
anxiety tips.
Well, it's pretty big to oxygenate.
Yes.
So when we're stressed, we're breathing very shallowly. So taking a deep breath, getting
Mhm.
oxygen into our brain because we're stressed in that moment.
Yeah.
There's a question for both of you here. Thank you. Here it comes. Um, did you have any questions you didn't know the answer to, and how'd you handle it? So I'll let you think about that for a second. Were there any questions that you were asked and you didn't know the answer? How'd you handle that? Do you want to start, Sehrish?
Yeah, I'm thinking of the moment. I can't remember the exact question, but I was really honest. It was asked by my external examiner, and I can't remember what that question was at this point. Um, but I was just really honest that that's an area that I haven't had the opportunity to explore, and that's something I could look into. It's in my notes somewhere, and it got buried, so I
Yeah.
should really look back and see what that
Yeah.
question was. But yeah, it was just really honest, an honest answer that this is something I haven't had the yet to
Mhm.
yet have had the opportunity to tackle yet. I think being authentic and honest is really, really important than to jumble mumble again.
Yeah.
So that's really how I approached it. The
Yeah.
honesty.
Yeah. And knowing you, you're going to go back to your notes when we end this and go look for that, aren't you? Yeah.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Yeah. Sian, what about you? Did that happen to you? And what can you share?
Yeah, that happened to me. So I can't remember the exact question as well, but it was something to do with like a stats-based question and a certain type of analysis. And um basically I didn't try to, make an educated guess or anything. I just said, based on my understanding of the statistical analysis, XYZ, and I said, but I'm not entirely sure. I really said that. And then it was really refreshing because of the format of the defense. It was really conversational. So my external committee member, was really explaining to me, the type of analysis and how it went. So it really, it was such a refreshing experience to know that you were kind of being guided through the things that you didn't know as well, which is obviously helpful as
Mhm.
junior researchers like
Mhm.
myself.
Can
Yeah,
I
there's
add
some.
something?
Go ahead,
Sorry.
Sirish. Please
Yeah, I
add.
was gonna add on that, like seeing this as a feedback too, is to also see that you have gaps in your area and to kind of be open to that, to be open to the criticism, open your mind that
Mhm.
this is an opportunity to you won't. My director said this, and I absolutely loved it. He said you will never have six nerds in the room who'll sit there and be passionate about your research
Yeah,
in the same way. You'll never get this opportunity again, right? So take this as a conversation and a learning
it
process
is.
and as a way to get their feedback on your work.
And this is really why I want folks, depending on accommodations, et cetera, to consider having your exam in person. It's just a very special moment. And you do have, I wouldn't call them nerds, I would call them people that really are interested and passionate about your work and want to have a scholarly discussion. It's just, you'll never forget it. You too will never forget it. I've never forgotten both of mine. I can still see the room. I still know where we went for lunch afterwards. We have a question in our chat that's saying, sometimes I feel overconfident. How should I control myself? I don't know if I like that word, but because our colleague is saying sometimes it leads them to make mistakes. So how would you want to respond to that, my panelists? feeling overconfident, maybe sometimes making mistakes? What would you suggest?
I would probably kind of bring it back to the points that we were discussing earlier, in terms of, you can have that feeling of overconfidence, but there are probably questions or certain aspects of the research that make you nervous, and still pay attention to those things, because that's where you can find your weaknesses or things that you need to really brush up on. So for me, that would probably be the advice I would give for that. And overconfidence isn't necessarily a fully negative thing, as long as you know how to kind of balance both ends in terms of being confident in your abilities, but also understanding if there's a weakness, not to ignore it, not to say, oh, that might not come up during the defense, because
Right.
there's a possibility that it might.
Yeah. Yeah. Whatever you're worried about, like Sehrish said, it's a sign. And I just like you to take control of it and say, I'm feeling wobbly on this one. Nice. Did you want to add, Sehrish?
I was I paused for a really long time because I was
Yeah.
thinking about how I'll put it out there. Initially, I was feeling very overconfident, and as the time came closer, I started to get nervous, and so I also think there's some kind of a signal to overconfidence as well. Could it be that I haven't prepared enough, and I'm fooling myself that which is I'm really talking about myself here, because I 3 or 4 weeks before, someone had asked, "You must be really nervous." I said, "No, I'm actually really confident." And then as the time came closer, I started to get really, really nervous, and that was a sign that no, I wasn't well prepared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't stress enough doing some mocks, like you all have said, and what the literature has told me that informed our presentation is trying to do some dry runs for sure. And for our colleague who asked that question, try and be more kind to yourself. You're not about controlling yourself. Like, you want to feel confident. That's a good thing. You've done a lot. You have mastery. Yeah, so just be kinder to yourself. Someone in the chat asked, what is the rate of fails? And this always comes up because we're always nervous, aren't we? I will say that it is best practice for supervisors and committees to not put somebody forward until they're ready, right? It's not in the olden days. It was like do or die. You're just going forward, and it was terrible. The grad studies has emerged over the last several decades where there's a lot more work that goes into preparing you. Someone said, how long should I expect between submitting a full draft to my committee and the defense? And what I'll say is, if your committee has read each chapter and given you feedback on each chapter, which is best practice, not sending the whole thing to somebody, 200 pages, and they've never read it, then you're going to have massive delays. People take months to read that. But if it's, really been fine-tuned and everybody's given feedback and you've revised and you've sent it, the general guideline is 3 weeks, that any committee should have generally 15 business days to review something. That's in Faculty of Grad Studies guidelines. See if there's anything else juicy in here for you all. Yeah, this is nice. Thank you. I have a question about post-defense. After my first defense, one of your colleagues says, I ruminated about what I should have said in the moment for days and a week after. Did any of you experience that? And if so, how did you stop that negative self-talk? I see Sehrish is just ready to go with this answer. Go for it.
Yeah, I'm like that all the time. I have this. I still, after all the work that I do, I have this imposter syndrome that I could have done, should have done. Yeah, what has happened, what didn't happen, what could have happened, and um, I just remind myself of the good enough. I did the best I could in the moment, in that present moment. And I go back to my mindfulness practices. That's why those are so important for me, my meditation. And Sian, you talked about breath work. Of course, that's such an important part of all of this. but also using that opportunity for feedback. I love
Mhm.
getting feedback from every talk I do, and using that as a space for improvement rather than like bashing myself down with a bad. I see life as a learning process. You know, I love Carol Dweck's growth mindset, and so this idea that I'm on a journey, it's a road, and it's a learning process for me. And okay, what did I take from here? What are my feedback, and how will I use that to become a better version of myself in the future, whether it's a defense, whether it's a talk, whatever that may be. And so I see all of this as a learning opportunity, and I have to again reframe that rather than ruminate. And so that's my part of my pattern interruption. These are the narratives. You know, I rewrite that and I say, this is how I can design my future. This is the learning that I take from this.
Mhm. Sian, do you want to add to that?
Yeah. So those are some really good points, Cherish. But also in terms of what I did was trying to focus on the outcome that you were successful. For me, that kind of helped dampen any type of um, ruminating or overthinking on what I could have done better. Really being proud of the fact that you got this far, you did what you need to do to be successful, but also at the same time, like Sheris mentioned, to analyze that feedback and use that to help improve yourself for the future, for your future research, and how you can possibly incorporate that into any type of future work you do within that field, I think is
Mhm.
important too. So kind of that balance.
Yeah. We're getting close to our time. I'm just going to take one last quick look. There's a lot of questions about MRPs, which are major research papers. I'll say that different programs require different things. Some MRPs have an oral exam. They have a different number of people that are at that oral exam. So that would be a discipline or program specific question for all of you asking about the MRP. Some don't have external examiners. Some just have internals, some just have your committee kind of thing. A lot of people want the slides, and so I'm going to work with my colleague Debbie. I'm going to develop a handout and it will be sent to all the participants. So let me just one last check. So just Tarek is asking about the comprehensive exam. It's the same principles though, about being prepared. Some comps you actually have a chance to do a presentation in nursing. The comp has a presentation. Other comps, there's no presentation. You're basically getting questions fired at you after writing a couple of things and submitting. But the same thing runs true around preparation and reading your work really well. Okay. With that, just going to share my screen one last time. What fantastic questions we have had, really. And there's just so much more that we could talk about. So I don't know if Sian or Sehrish want to share. Let me just go to this slide. Want to share their emails. If they do, I'll put it on the handout for all of you. If you wanted to be in touch with them, you can certainly be in touch with me about anything that's popped up for you. But I do want to say you've got this, that it does take courage. It took courage to apply and talk about imposter syndrome going, who, they picked me? You think I'm good enough? And then your first class and your first paper and all of that, and you're still thinking, am I good enough? Well, yeah, you are. And it is about courage. I love this little dog. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just that quiet voice, Serish's voice, about mindfulness. It says, I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to try again tomorrow. So we want you to stay in touch with us. This was our Scholarly Skills webinar. We're going to have a lot more of them. It will be on our YouTube channel next week, our Faculty of Grad Studies YouTube channel, and we're on all the socials. And so you can keep in touch with us that way. Our communication team does a lot of advertising on there if you want to be aware. So with that, I really want to thank all of you for coming. I especially want to thank our two alumni, Sian and Sehrish, for all the thoughtful preparation for today and for coming and speaking and being recorded. Thanks very much, everybody.